The Gadigal were the first people inhabiting the land that we are now standing on.
Their knowledge, culture and tradition was passed on orally and through ritual.
It's usually held that Australian Aboriginal people originally came from Southeast Asia and have been in Australia for at least 50,000 years. On the basis of research at archaeological sites in the Northern Territory, however, some scientists have claimed that early humans arrived way sooner, perhaps as early as 65,000 to 80,000 years ago. In either case, the first settlement would have occurred during an era of lowered sea levels, when there were more coextensive land bridges between Asia and Australia. However, watercraft must have been used for some passages, such as those between Bali and Lombok, and between Timor and Greater Australia, because of the entailed distances greater than 120 miles. This is the earliest confirmed seafaring in the world. How cool is that? By about 35,000 years ago, all of the continent had been occupied, including the southwest and southeast corners, as well as the highlands of the island of New Guinea. The Aboriginals were scattered into 500 different clans or nations speaking about 700 languages. Aboriginal societies were established all over Australia based on equity and consensus with defined rights and responsibilities. Living primarily along the foreshores of the harbour, they fished and hunted in the waters and hinterlands of the area and harvested food from the surrounding bush. Self-sufficient and harmonious, they had no need to travel far from their lands, since the resources around them were so abundant and the trade with other tribal groups was well established.
As part of getting to know the culture of Indigenous Australia, we are now going to present some of the important and unique concepts that plays a significant role in the understanding of the Indigenous people. First off, it's the connection to country. Land means different things to non-Indigenous and Aboriginal people. Non-Indigenous people and landowners might consider land as something they own, a commodity to be bought and sold, an asset to make profit from, but also a means to make a living off it or simply home. For Aboriginal people, the relationship is much deeper. They have a spiritual, physical, social and cultural connection to the land. But the connection they feel to country can be a difficult concept for non-Indigenous people to grasp. The interdependence between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the land is based on respect. While the land sustains and provides for the people, people manage and sustain the land through culture and ceremony.
Aboriginal laws were encoded in each group's religious tradition and were handed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. All Indigenous people were familiar with their own laws and with the daily rights and obligations that were imposed. From early childhood, they learned what the law allowed and what it forbade.
Dreaming stories. The dreaming, or the dream time, is an oral history of the world and its creation, shared by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Passed down through generations, these stories commonly feature characters who display undesirable behaviors and face retribution because of it. In this way, the dreaming illustrates rules for living and interacting with the natural environment. Aboriginals believe that the dream time was way back at the very beginning. The land and the people were created by the spirits. They made the rivers, streams, waterholes, the land, hills, rocks, plants, and animals. It is believed that the spirits gave them their hunting tools and each tribe its land, their totems, and their dreaming. The dreaming stories display a deep knowledge of country. They contain key information about flora, fauna, and laws to obey in order to survive in microenvironments. During pre-contact days, these stories were an integral and memorable way in which to impart knowledge from one generation to the next to ensure survival. Although the dreaming is an English approximation of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concept, this is known as Jakurpa in the Walpiri language of Central Australia, though it has different titles for different language groups. The dreaming is considered a vastly inadequate translation of Jakurpa, a concept which is foreign to English speakers due to its complexity.
Aboriginal spirituality is totemic, A totem is a natural object, plant, or animal that's inherited by members of a clan or a family as their spiritual emblem. Totems define people's roles and responsibilities and their relationships with each other and creation. Totems are believed to be descendants of Dreamtime heroes and are linked to different places. A typical boy story might begin before he's even born. As his mother becomes conscious of his first movements in the womb, she immediately has to take a note of the area so that the infant will become identified with the spirit of the particular area in which she is located. This is based on the belief that the spirit of that area has energized the infant in the womb, and the child becomes inextricably linked with the spirit associated with the dominant creation of that place, as his conception totem.
In 1770, James Cook and Joseph Banks first discovered Botany Bay, and the crew went onto the land of the Darwin people. After that, Britain's interest in Australia began, and they decided to establish a penal colony at Botany Bay. 18 years later, in 1788, Arthur Phillips and 1,500 convicts, crew, marines and civilians sailed into Botany Bay. However, the land was quickly ruled unsuitable for settlement, and all the ships sailed to the national harbour of Port Jackson in order to establish the colony there instead.
The arrival of James Cook and then Arthur Phillips marked the beginning of white settlement. The colonial takeover was premised on the assumption that European culture was superior to all others, and that Europeans could define the world in their terms. The colonization of Australia had a devastating impact on Indigenous people who had lived on this land for thousands of years. In the 10 years that followed, it is estimated that the Indigenous population of Australia was reduced by 90%. Three main reasons for the dramatic population decline was the introduction of new diseases, the settler acquisition of Indigenous lands, and also direct and violent conflict.
Ever since the British first invaded Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have had their land stolen from them or destroyed. Most has still to be returned today, and the loss of their land has had a devastating social and physical impact on the Aboriginal people. During much of the 20th century, outright killings were replaced with a policy of removing Aboriginal children from their parents and giving them to white families or replacing them in mission schools. The removal of generations of children disrupted transfer of knowledge and oral culture between generations, and thus cultural knowledge was lost. This is referred to the stolen generations. Today, the Aboriginal people only account for 3.3% of the population, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And in 2016, the majority, 81% of the Aboriginal people, lived in cities and non-remote areas, which contradicts the myth that most of them live in the outback. The Aboriginal peoples only account for a small percentage of the population, and generally they have poor living conditions. To mention a few reasons, there is the lack of education, high unemployment rates, and poverty. Although most Aboriginal people of today go to school, work, and raise families just like any other group in society, even to this day, the Aboriginal still face racist attitudes and has to deal with prejudice on an everyday basis. In the video we are going to show you next, you get to hear some of the myths and stereotypes that the students and staff at the University of Sydney has to confront in their everyday life.
Is it ever okay to ask someone how Aboriginal they are? Oh my God.
I get this all the time.
Short answer means no.
Can I just answer it flatly, straight? No, it's never okay to ask somebody how Aboriginal they are. It's very offensive to ask that question.
If you look at our history, there's a reason why people aren't 100% Aboriginal, and that's really heartbreaking. I think it opens up to you having to justify yourself and justify how much you are or how much you feel. It's just kind of taking away from who you really are and your identity. So,
Definitely.
what's the one thing about Indigenous people or culture that others can't seem to understand? One. I can't pick one.
Friends of mine always talk to me, and I've grown up very middle class white Australian, so from 10 years old I went to a school where I was the only Indigenous child, and I went right through high school. And even now as an older person, a big thing that my friends ask me is like, why don't we know about these Indigenous things, these Aboriginal stories, or why aren't they shared, or why aren't things marked? And it's pretty much, because there's stories in our lives that we don't have to share because they're our own stories, and makes the story a little more watered down once we share it with people, because then people share it on and it changes its meaning.
What obstacles stand between Indigenous kids and higher education?
This varies for a lot of Indigenous kids, but it comes down to varying degrees of prejudice. If no one believes that you're going to be there, then you're not going to be there, and you're just going to fall under what everyone expects of you. What's the best part of being Indigenous? This just reminded me of, there's nothing I would rather be than to be an Aborigine.
Everything's great. I guess being connected to culture, and we're lucky enough to have great teachers, and we're lucky enough to be in a mob that is still very strong culturally and still practices ceremony, and to be part of that it's like nothing else.
So for me, it's at that cellular level. Like, every part of me is an Aboriginal woman, and I'm proud of my heritage, and I know that the footsteps that I take have been walked by my ancestors, and that they guide me.
Being black and deadly, yeah.
And I think we're pretty black and deadly ourselves, so that's another good part.